Good evening, everybody. If you're in South Africa, or good morning if you're in America, welcome to Aquarius Rising Africa again. And I'm so happy to have back with me John Perkins, the author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman. How are you, sir?
I'm great, thank you, Chantelle. I'm just fine, happy to be with you again.
Yeah, absolutely. Very happy to have you back. That's for sure. I know I really enjoyed chatting with you the last time. And as I said to you, I remember you from many moons ago. Um, had the television station, yeah, investigative journalists, and for me, that story was just quite mind blowing. But maybe if you wouldn't mind, just before, because I know we're going to talk more about the Chinese side of it today, but maybe you wouldn't mind just giving an overview again of just who you are, your book, etc. Just for those that haven't watched you before.
Well, I'm John Perkins, and I was at one time chief economist at a major international consulting firm. But my job was really what we call that of an economic hitman. And I had a staff of anywhere from 30 to 50 people working for me at different times. And my job was to identify countries that had resources our corporations want, like oil. Today it might be lithium, cobalt, the high-tech minerals that are necessary, and identify such a country and then arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. But the money never actually went to the country. It went to our own corporations, usually big engineering construction companies like Halliburton, Bechtel, Stone & Webster, Brown & Root, you name it, to build big infrastructure projects in that country. And of course, these companies that built this infrastructure, things like power plants and industrial parks, highways, ports, airports, they made a lot of money, the companies that built them. And also, these were big benefits to a few of the wealthy families in those countries, the families that owned the industries, the commercial establishments, things that really benefited from this improved infrastructure. But the majority of the people actually suffered as a result because money was diverted from healthcare, education, other social services to pay the interest on the loans. And in the end, the loans couldn't be repaid, usually. And so I'd go back. We'd go back usually in the guise of the International Monetary Fund and restructure the loan for the country. But that required that the country make certain concessions. For example, selling oil or whatever the resource happens to be real cheap to our corporations without environmental or social regulations, or vote with us on a United Nations vote against Cuba, for example, or let us build a military base on their soil, or privatize their public sector businesses like water and sewage systems and sell them to our investors, things like this. So really what we were doing was making these countries kind of servants to a global empire, really a corporate empire that's supported very strongly by the United States. And incidentally, if leaders didn't agree to the deals I was offering them, they were very aware that there were people in the background with guns, and so I had money, billions of dollars here, but if they didn't accept it, it was the guns. And I didn't carry a gun, but they knew there were the jackals behind us, and these were people that overthrow or assassinate the leaders of countries. And there's a long history of that in Chile and South Africa, and Lumumba, the Congo, and Diem of Vietnam, and most recently Zelaya of Honduras. So it's a game, and it's an empire building game, and it's a very, very deadly game and a very serious game.
Wow. Yeah, I do believe, that's again, listening to your book as well, and reading what you had to say about that. I think, it's really no great surprise at all for many of us, but it's just good to know. And I mean, I really appreciate people like yourself who come out and speak about these things, because I really think it's time that we know about this. And, you said something very interesting in, I think, our last conversation we had. And you said, all of us on some level are actually participating in the system. So whether we are working for banks or companies that belong to the cabal or whatever it is, you know, we are all sort of participating. So it's easy to point fingers at a couple of people, but at the end of the day, you know, it's up to each and every one of us individuals to make the change. My question to you is just regarding that. Were you aware of what you were doing? Were you aware that you were playing this deadly game of sort of, I guess, you know, you can say it was like the bully boy tactics, because of course, America being a superpower, having the money and the power, kind of like, and I'm also well aware that you were not working for the government, right? You were working for a company that subcontracted to maybe the World Bank, places like that, right? So you weren't directly involved with that. But were you aware of what you were doing? Were you aware that you were kind of shaking people and really taking their resources?
It's a really important question because, yes, I was aware and thought I was doing the right thing. So I graduated from business school. Then I'd been in the Peace Corps, living in the Amazon rainforest and the Andes of South America. And I
That I
really,
found very interesting. Sorry to intervene here, but you know that you were actually trained in the Peace Corps of all things, you know, because that would be kind of like a front, wouldn't it? So that would serve as like a cover, if you will, for something quite, you know, maybe more nefarious that they were training you in or had intentions for you to be involved in.
I don't think that was the case, at least for me. It may be for others. I
Right.
wouldn't say that it isn't, but uh, I went into the Peace Corps because I didn't want to go to Vietnam, and there was a draft, and I didn't believe in the war in Vietnam. I didn't want to go off and kill people I had nothing against or be killed by them. So
Sure.
the Peace Corps was an alternative. But you know, in business school, and it's still in business schools, we're taught that if you want to help a country rise out of poverty, uh, what we call a lower income nation or a developing country, the way to do this is to invest a lot of money in infrastructure. And we can prove, and it was proven to me, and I made these studies that showed that when you do that, the GDP, the gross domestic product, increases. And so
Right.
I believed for quite a few years that I was doing the right thing because I was helping to increase GDP. But over time, and especially working with one head of state, the head of state of Panama, Omar Torrijos, who became a friend and was he was determined to stand up to the big bully in the North, the United States, and win the canal back to Panamanian ownership, which he eventually did. But this man was an amazing human being, and he explained to me, you know, you're not helping decrease poverty in these countries. The GDP does not decrease, it does not increase prosperity for the majority of the people. And I came to understand, Chantelle, that GDP is a very poor measure. It's a good measure for the very rich, and what it really measures is how well the rich are doing in the big corporations. And so,
Right.
we can show, you know, and so I was convinced that I was doing the right thing for many years until I saw the light, so to speak. And so many people in this business today believe that they're doing the right thing. I recently gave a talk at a university in California about this, what I did. And what I said is, you know, I was creating what we call today a death economy. It's an economic system that's consuming and polluting itself towards self-destruction, climate
Right.
change, income inequality, etc. And we need to move into a life economy. We could get into that later if you want. But at the end of this talk I gave at this university, I asked if anybody had questions, and I called on a gentleman who said that he was a tenured professor of economics at this university. And he said, you know, I've realized that since I've been here, I've been teaching students how to become successful in the death economy. And he said that I never realized that before. And this is
Right.
so typical that we are brought up with this idea that if we want to help a poor country, get our corporations to build big infrastructure projects in that country, help them to, you know, mine for oil or whatever the material is, and that'll help everybody. It doesn't help everybody.
Would that be part of the brainwashing? Would that be part of the brainwashing, do you think?
Yeah, you can call it that. And I don't, it's certainly part of our system, part of the whole economic system that we've foisted on the world. And now the Chinese are doing something very, very similar. So it's part of the belief in a form of capitalism that I call predatory capitalism, that's skewed very much in favor of the rich and powerful.
Right, exactly. I have to say, and I'm going to ask you to speak about that, because there's one part in your book as well that I loved. And I always think it takes a good woman to make a man see sense. Right. So do you want to talk us through that? What got you to open your eyes, actually, to see that maybe what you were doing was not in the best interests of humanity at the end of the day?
Let's be fair. To start with, it was a woman who got me into all of this.
Yes, I do. I remember that.
Once I was recruited to work at this consulting firm, very, very quickly I was introduced to this woman named Claudine Martin. At least that's the name I was given, and she took me off for private training and taught me, and you're going to be doing this job of, and she told me exactly what I was going to be doing. She really taught me how to do it, and she was very effective. And she knew I had 3 weaknesses from a lie detector test I had taken with the National Security Agency. And those 3 weaknesses were I wanted money, power, and sex. And she taught me about all 3 of these very well.
She supplied the world, did she?
Yeah, she did. And so now here it is, like 7 or 8 years later, and I've been out there selling the story that I'm beginning to understand is a lie. Elma Torrijos is helping me understand that I'm not really helping majority of people in countries become more prosperous. I'm helping grow GDP, helping the rich get richer. And I'm also, I'd been married, and I was going through a divorce, and I have an office in Colombia as well as in Panama and Tehran, Iran, and I'm spending a lot of time in Colombia with a woman who I'll call Paula, and we were having this very heated romance, and Paula had a brother who had joined what became FARC, this what we now consider a terrorist organization. At the time, it was an organization that was really fighting against exploitation. It changed over time. And she very quickly helped me understand that I needed to get out. And I said, but I'm afraid to get out. I don't think I can get out. And she said, well, just tell them when you get out that you promise you'll never expose the system as you know it. You're just going to get out, and because you're burned out, you've been in this for almost 10 years now, and you're tired and you want to move on. So she was very, very important in helping me come around from that aspect. So I had these 2 bookends with these 2 amazing women, who one that got me into the business and one that very much helped me get out of the business.
Always the woman, right?
Yeah, exactly.
One way or the other. Yeah, that's amazing, though. Okay, so now you got the business. I'd actually just like to hear more about it before we move on to the Chinese side of things. Interesting, because what you also said was that if they were not taking the bait from you, the economic hitman with the money in your hand, right, there would be the jackals that was behind them. And if that didn't work, then the military industrial complex would be involved. Can you just talk us through how that whole system works? So, the jackals, I think there was a movie called The Day of the Jackal. I don't know if that has any relevance to this, but I remember it had something to do with assassinations or something like that. I never saw it, but my father did it. He told me. So I would imagine that as you say, they would then come in and do the dirty work, because there were a couple of people that were died in plane crashes, right? So it would never be as obvious as, well, so-and-so has been assassinated. might be, but it would never really be pointing back to the Americans, would it? How would that whole system work?
Well, it didn't point back to the Americans directly, but the message went through, and other heads of
Right.
state would understand this. So, if you go back to the early 70s, if you back to the early 50s, you've got Mossadegh in Iran, who was taken, who was overthrown in obviously a CIA coup that was led by a CIA agent named Kermit Roosevelt. That kind of started this process. And then later on in the early 70s, and there were things in between, but there was a Allende in Cuba, in Chile. And, again, the United States was not directly implicated, but it was pretty obvious that Henry Kissinger and others were extremely supportive of Pinochet, this dictator who took over after Allende was overthrown and died in the process. And we've never been, they said he committed suicide, but there's a lot of evidence that it wasn't a suicide. Anyway, that's another story. So, the leaders of countries know that this happens. And it made my job pretty easy because I go in and say, hey, I'm going to help you build these projects that are going to make you and your family even richer, because you guys own, most of these presidents were part of the system that owned the big industries and commercial establishments. And incidentally, if you buy into this deal, my firm is located in Boston. We've got really good connections with a lot of universities in the area, some great universities in Boston. We'll make sure that your son or daughter and those of your cronies get into these universities, and we'll give them a full scholarship. And we'll pay them to work for us during Christmas and summer breaks. And when they finish college, they can have a job with our that's worth a lot of money to these guys. And it's perfectly legal, incidentally. It's perfectly legal. In fact, we bragged about it. My company would, have interviews with the Boston Globe, the big local paper, and say, look, we donated $1 million last year to scholarships for people from these poor countries. We forget to mention that we gave the money to families that didn't need the scholarships. But anyway, so this whole process, so it was really to the advantage of these leaders to accept the deals from many standpoints, and to know, and they knew that if they didn't accept the deals, then they were likely to get into trouble, be overthrown or taken out.
Yeah.
And the two that stood up to this was the democratically elected president of Ecuador, Jaime Roldos, and Omar Torrijos, who I mentioned from Panama. And they had tremendous integrity, these guys, and they were either very courageous or a little nutty. Maybe it took both, but they stood up to the system. They refused to go along with it, and they opposed, in the case of Roldos, the oil companies, and in the case of Torrijos, a lot, and especially the Panama Canal issue. And they both died in almost the same way in their small plane crashes, in less than 3 months apart from each other. It was pretty obvious to much of the world what had happened, but there was never proof. I have no proof that anything other than a plane crash happened. And if you wanted to take somebody out, a private plane is a pretty damn good way to do it, because the smoking gun goes down with the plane. And, it's pretty hard to prove afterwards that it was anything other than but there was a lot of evidence that pointed to this.
Did you know they were going to do that? Were you made aware?
Well, no, not directly. There was always the fear. I had a fear that something would happen to these guys, and I liked them. I was good friends with. I felt like I was good friends with Torrijos. He was a party guy, and he invited me to a lot of his parties. And Roldos was much more formal, and I never felt the friendship, but I knew him, and I was afraid that these guys, because they weren't buying the deals, that something would happen to them. But I had no warning. After Roldos died in his plane crash, Torrijos met with his family, and I know this is a fact, and he said to them, my brother Jaime just got assassinated, and I'll probably be next. But don't let it bother you, because I've accomplished what I really wanted to accomplish. I signed the Canal Treaty with Jimmy Carter, so the Panama Canal was going to revert to Panamanian ownership. And that was my biggest goal. But he said, I'll probably be next. So he was aware of this. And in less than 3 months later, his plane, in almost the same, under the same very similar conditions, crashed and killed him. So these, so he was very aware, and after what happened to Roldos, I had great fear that something would happen to Torrijos. I was never advised that it was going to happen. Good heavens, no! I wouldn't want to be an accomplice.
How did you feel when they were?
Terrible. And I had just, as I write in my books, I had just quit my job. I had given in. I'd listened to Paula in Colombia. I'd listened to Torrijos, and I'd gone through a moment of deep enlightenment in the Virgin Islands and quit. And so by the time this happened, I was actually, I had left that job a few months earlier, and I was relieved not to be part of that system anymore. And yet I still was kind of part of it because I was doing some consulting work, but I felt terrible. I mean, I particularly, I really knew Torrijos. I felt I knew him well, and I missed him, and I was terribly upset at what happened to Jaime Roldos. And I became friends later with his daughter, who was 17 at the time that he died, and she became a politician in Ecuador, and I spent some time talking to her, and it was a very, very sad moment for me, very tragic, but it totally confirmed what I had been suspecting and why I left.
I was going to say, was that kind of the turning point for you?
Well, I'd already reached the turning point, but that confirmed for me that I'd done the right thing to get the hell out. And it also reinforced my desire to expose the system, to write about it, and to do all that I could, and still feel this way, can do to change it.
I want to get there, but before that, I want to just ask you about. It seems to me that I would imagine that was the Jackals doing their job, right? Blowing up little airplanes and stuff like that. At what point would the military come in there? Because what you would say, if the Jackals didn't get it right, the military would come in. So at what point and how were the military brought in to do further cleanup operations, call it that?
Well, that's what happened with Saddam Hussein. He didn't go along with the system, and I mean there were many factors involved there. Also, Gaddafi in Libya, and in Panama later, when Noriega wasn't playing the game, the military went in. The U.S. military in full force, went in and firebombed parts of Panama City. Killed a lot of civilians, and it was in U.S. planes that were clearly identified as that, U.S. soldiers. So because after Torrijos, there was Noriega. Noriega was a very corrupt man. I did not like him at all. But there was no reason for the military to do what they did to take him out. They could have taken him out in many, many other ways. That's another whole story. But so, so there's a lot of examples of the military. And of course, if we go back to Allende in Chile, the military was involved. It was the Chilean military, but it obviously had the support and some training from the CIA. In the case of Torrijos, I've done a lot of research on this and talked to a lot of people, and it very much appears that probably that plane crash was arranged by the Secret Service of Argentina, which was under a military dictator at the time and very much under the control of the CIA. So rather than having American operatives actually do it, there's a very good possibility that it was Argentine operatives that did it under U.S. Guidance. Again, no proof. There's no proof at all, and I'm not claiming that I know what happened, but there's evidence that I've seen that points to that. So, and this is kind of typical, when it's the old mafia. I mean, it is the mafia on a very large global level process that's been going on for centuries of, deniable the culpability that like, no, we didn't do it, they did it. But why did they do it?
Isn't it called plausible deniability or something like that?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and it's a very effective system.
I'm going to ask you a question as well. What is your knowledge about what happened in Africa? I mean, and anything specific to South Africa that you know of?
Well, I know no more than you do or what I've read about. I never worked in Africa other than Northern Africa, Egypt. So, I write about and talk about where I've had personal experience, and I haven't had any personal experience there. In my latest book of the Economic Hitman trilogy that just came out about a year ago, I talk about China in Africa, but that's all based on research and talking to people. I have no personal experience there.
Oh, they're all right.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a major way. Gosh, they've taken over Africa, like, I don't know, a swarm of bees, boy. They are here.
But I write in one of the books, I think it's the most recent one, I'm not sure, about a friend of mine who was a jackal, and became a friend. I was a martial artist most of my life, and he and I were both black belts in the same school, and so we became good friends. And he was involved in the South African elite military forces, the Reckies, and you probably know of them, and several others. He was trained. He was trained in South Africa and eventually went to Rhodesia, which became
the Sleeve Scouts.
Yeah. And he was involved in the attempt to overthrow the president of the Seychelles, Francois Rene, that failed. And they all, the group that went in to take out Rene, they had a firefight at the airport in the Seychelles and ended up hijacking an Air India 707 and flying it back to Durban, South Africa, and where they were taken into custody. And they were supposed to be executed, that the ringleaders and the others were going to spend a lot of time in prison. And he kind of laughed at that they had a very luxurious experience in prison, and then were released within several months, or in the worst cases, a couple of years. So, it was interesting to experience that guy and his relationship with South Africa. He was an American who grew up in Beirut. His dad was an executive with Middle East Airlines. So he grew up in Beirut and then later became a mercenary.
Yeah, there was that. I remember that story. And then wasn't there also something, I'm trying to think of Kuwait. Wasn't South Africa involved in Kuwait? Something in Kuwait as well.
I don't know.
My memory is a little bit foggy around that, but there was all sorts of things. And then what's the British Prime Minister, the lady, Margaret Thatcher, her son was involved as well. Mark Thatcher, that's his name. Mark Thatcher was involved as well. Yeah, no, we there definitely, there's a dirty bunch. Yeah, we're a dirty bunch. And it would be the Selous Scouts, obviously, from Rhodesia, the Reckies, and then the Kufuta from Namibia, or old Southwest Africa. And of course, all those armies were always joined. And I mean, really, elite forces. I mean, I know that Green Berets and a whole lot of the American Special Forces would come and train here for bush war. They were obviously experts in bush war. Crazy, horrible. And you see, I mean, also a girl I worked with, in fact, she's an SRA survivor, and her father was very high up in the Selous Scouts. And she actually showed me pictures. I mean, they walk around with these human skulls and all sorts of things. I mean, there's nothing
very,
sacred about anything.
a tough bunch. I told you I was a black belt in the same school as this this guy who was a friend. But even though he was a friend, I knew that when we sparred with each other, even if I could get in a good kick or punch, I shouldn't do it. Because even though we were friends, if he got hit, man, he went crazy. I mean, this guy was
Yeah.
tough and brutal. And I remember, he had a lot of great stories. I remember one of his stories, he said that early on in his career, he'd seen a guy that was being attacked by, an opponent, and his gun jammed. His friend's gun jammed, and the guy tried to fix his gun, and the opponent came over and killed him. So the same thing happened to my friend. And he had the same experience. The guy coming out of the bush at him, and he's getting ready to shoot him. His gun jams, and he remembers, his brain works very quickly. And instead of trying to fix the gun, he throws the gun at the guy, pulls out a knife. The guy's like being hit by the weapon being thrown at him,
Wow.
and pulls out his knife and kills him.
And does.
Yeah, so
Crazy.
yeah, I mean, tough, and he loved to fight. He liked to pick barroom fights. He fights. His wife was South African. She was a psychologist from South Africa, very attractive, and he would catch men in a bar in the United States looking at her.
I'm dying to ask you who she is, but I won't.
No, I wouldn't tell you. But he liked to pick fights. That was
exactly. But seriously, I think they're all a little bit when they come back from there. Definitely. I mean, I know some. I grew up in the apartheid era, and in the height of the Bush Wars. And I know some of my classmates, when we left school, I mean, it was just, and these young guys, and most of them, the sad thing about that is they all died. So many of them died in what they call, obviously, friendly fire. They really just lost the plot in so many of those instances. And we would be told, no, they were on these extravagant sort of wars that they were fighting and killing the terrorists who were, coming in. Oh, we were brainwashed. If anyone was brainwashed, I'll tell you what, we were brainwashed. That was for sure at those times. Anyway,
well,
interesting.
In this particular case, my friend who grew up in Beirut, he at one time was taken captive by the PLO and taken to this and pistol whipped and eventually released. It was a case of mistaken identity when he was a teenager. And so he grew up hating Muslims, and so that was and communists, and so that was one of the reasons that we all have these justifications. Like I was, if you call brainwashed to believe that the system was right, but people grow up with these very, very strong belief systems and biases. Whether
you were superior, boy, as a white in this country, you were superior. We're certainly paying the price now, though. We're paying the price for our ancestors. That's for sure.
Yeah,
everything has been flipped on its head, which I guess is, it's par for the course.
Yeah.
But definitely, I know all about that false sense of superiority.
Yeah.
And we had, that's for sure. But anyway, interesting times, and we're really living in crazy and amazing times. So another question I want to ask you is that, I mean, at some point there must have been some kind of retribution for you writing your book, right? I mean, you must have. Did they ever come after you? Did they ever attempt to do anything to you? There must have been something.
Well, so when I first started to write the book, I wanted to make it an expose that included stories from other people who did similar work. And I started contacting them. And almost immediately, I got anonymous phone calls threatening my life and that of my infant daughter. And I took these calls very, very seriously. I was terrified because I knew what these guys could do. And at about the same time, I was invited out to dinner by the president of Stoner Webster Engineering Company, has been a competitor of my company. Now I've quit my company. I'm without a job at this point, and I'm just starting a relationship with a woman I ended up getting married to and having a child with. So I'd been through all that, and now the child is there, and she's an infant, and I don't really have much of a job. I'm doing some consulting. and I am getting these threats on our lives. And I'm taken out to dinner by this president, and he says, you have a great resume. You were chief economist of one of our rivals. We'd like to use your resume in our proposals. You don't have to do much work for us. We might ask you to have a dinner with some people sometime or get together with some people. You don't have to do much work for us, and I'm prepared to write you a check, a consultant's retainer check tomorrow morning for $500,000, $500,000. This is in the late 80s. $500,000 is nothing to sneeze at today, but it was a lot more back then. And I'm without a job at this point, and my life is being threatened if I write the book. And he says, just don't write the book. So he knew he'd gotten the message. So I'm really getting what I've been dishing out for the last 10 years, and that is I'm being offered a lot of money in this hand or a gun in this hand, basically. Same scenario. What would you have done, Chantelle? What would you have done?
I would have taken the money and run.
I took the money, and I will say in my own defense, I didn't go out and buy fast cars or a big mansion or yacht. Maybe I should have, but I put the money back into going back to where I'd been a Peace Corps volunteer in the Amazon and forming nonprofits and going back there and saying, I want to help you guys save the Amazon. I know it's under attack. It's being destroyed. And I wrote 5 books on indigenous cultures and the Amazon. They all got published, and that was fine with Stoner Webster. They were happy to have me do that. And I began teaching workshops on indigenous cultures and shamanism and so on and so forth. But I did not write the book they told me not to write for many, many years. And then my contract has ended with Stoner Webster. It's 9/11, and I'm in the Amazon when 9/11 happens. And when I come back to the States, I fly up to ground zero. I was living in Florida at the time. And as I'm looking down at that smoldering pit, I know I've got to write about this. And so I decide that I won't tell anybody I'm writing about it. I won't contact other people. I'll write it as a personal story, a confession. So I don't have to contact anybody else. I'll do it completely in secret. And I figured that, once I get this book in the hands of a good agent in New York, and remember, I've already published 5 books on indigenous cultures. I was a known author at the time. And it starts to go out to publishers. Nobody's going to want to kill me because that'll sell books. And that's the opposite of what they would want to happen at that point. So I figured the book would be my insurance policy. As it turned out, it wasn't exactly. Then something else happened later. I don't know how much detail you want me to go into, but that was the way. That was why I wrote Confessions in 2004. It was published in 2004. I started running it right after 9/11.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So they didn't actually come after you in any way other than just a fair warning.
Well, a couple of months after the book is published, it's now gone to the New York Times bestseller list. In fact, it stayed there for more than 70 weeks. And I'm invited to speak at the United Nations, I think like 4 months after it was published. And the day before I'm supposed to speak at the United Nations, I've flown up to New York again. And that night, that at lunchtime, I had lunch. This guy picked me up at the airport. He'd arranged this with my publicist. He was a freelance journalist. And he took me out to lunch. I went to the restroom after the lunch had been served, which I've learned not to do. And we had lunch. He asked some very stupid questions, frankly. He obviously was not a very smart journalist. But I didn't think too much of it until a few hours later. I'm at the home of a friend of mine who I'm staying with on Central Park. And I lost a tremendous amount of blood, probably half the blood in my body, internal bleeding, like that. And we called, a friend of hers was a very well-known what do you call it? The intestinal doctor. And he said, I'm on the phone with him from her apartment at like 7:30 at night. And he says, my God, you'll be dead in a couple of hours. get a cab. Don't call an ambulance. It take too long. Get a cab. Get to Lenox Hill Hospital. I'll call ahead and get transfusions ready for you and whatever else is needed. And I did that, and I ended up 70% of my colon removed, my large intestine.
Wow.
And it wasn't, well, it wasn't until after that that we gave it any thought. At the moment we were just trying to keep me alive. And as soon as the word got out, so I had to cancel the United Nations, my publicist canceled it, and almost immediately we started getting emails. She started, the publicist, and others, my publisher. Don't you know John was poisoned? And it never, I mean, I hadn't given any thought to why this happened. And as it turned out, I'd had a colonoscopy a few months earlier, been given pretty much a clean bill of health. And I talked to my doctor, and he said, well, yeah, it's possible you were poisoned, but we have no evidence, because as soon as we removed that part of your intestine, we incinerated it, which is always the policy in these hospitals. So there was no proof. The guy that I'd had lunch with and had been in email contact with my publicist, but all she had was an email address. It was no longer active, and couldn't reach him. But in any case, we had no proof. So again, it's it's like the gun in the crashing planes. There's no proof, but I have a very, very strong suspicion that I was poisoned.
Wow, I can't imagine that it would have been anything else. That's for sure.
No, and after that, I called this friend of mine who'd been a Jackal, the guy I mentioned that was out of South Africa, and I asked him, and he said, you know, you may well have been poisoned, but I don't think it was one of the alphabet agencies, the FBI or the CIA or the NSA. He said, if they,
boys.
yeah, if they had done it, you wouldn't be talking to me. And they don't want you dead, because that'll sell books. If you die mysteriously, that's the worst thing that could happen as far as they're concerned. That'll sell books, you know. So I don't think it was anybody like that. And I said, well, who was it then? He said, I suspect it was a crazy person, you know, of somebody that was very upset at what you wrote, or upset at the fact that what you did as an economic hitman, or the fact that you exposed it. And I said, well, do I need to be fearful? Is this person going to continue to come after me? He said, I doubted. Most of those people are usually pretty cowardly. The fact that he poisoned you, and, you know, so if he did, and was so
asking you bad questions.
yeah. And he said, you know, he's disappeared. He's not going to show his face again.
Wow. Well, happy to have you still around with us, that's for sure.
Yeah.
As they say in the classics, only the good die young.
Well, maybe that's the reason I wasn't that good, you know, like I done a lot of things.
Still hanging in there.
You're not that young.
So now let's talk a little bit about China, because I just find this whole China thing, you know, when you were talking about the Chinese being the new economic hitman. And I know you've also lectured in China at I think one of the MBA schools or whatever it might be there. Yeah, I think we spoke about it the last time. Tell us your ideas on what that is, because I would like to find out as well this recent zappity doodah day, for which my channel has been struck a few times, and because I was speaking about that. You know, in my opinion, that could be the ultimate bioweapon and the ultimate economic hit. I don't know. Tell me what you think.
Well, yeah, you mentioned you know, I taught at an MBA program in Shanghai to most of the students were Chinese, and they had been hand selected to be the future leaders of China, or at least economic advisors and so forth. And very quickly, I came to understand the reason I was invited to speak there was because they wanted to pick my brains about what I'd done as an economic hitman that was successful and what mistakes I'd made. And, you know, the fact of the matter is that China has an amazing cadre of economic hitmen that are out there, and they're incredibly effective. they really have learned from our mistakes, and we made plenty of them. We made a lot of enemies around the world, for one thing. And China has just, gone into the void that we've created, and also just done an amazing job of, in the last, since basically since 2010, 2012, of pretty much taking over much of the world, of Africa, Latin America, many other places, including Europe, parts of Europe. And they are the number one investor and trading partner in many more countries today than the United States is. And that's been a pretty recent change within the last 10, 15 years. They've done an amazing job of exploiting the situation. I think they have the same goal, and that is bringing in more resources to their country and becoming the world superpower, replacing the United States.
For sure. So, I mean, when you say that they're doing a great job and they're very good at being the economic hitman, what is their strategy that they are using? I would have imagined, because I think you were around doing this in the 70s sometime. So, obviously things have evolved since then. We've got technology, social media, all of these things. And I would imagine right now an economic hit, if that's the word, would be quite effective done on a social media smear campaign type thing, right? As well. I mean, you can do a lot via social media. You don't actually have to necessarily take a person out, but I don't know. So I know, I mean, also China, how they, what I heard, maybe you can verify this, is that there's been such a move by the Chinese to literally dumb down the Americans over the past 20 years, basically, with social media, these cell phones, and a lot of people are so totally disconnected with things like TikTok, etc. And if you're just looking at what's happening in America now as well, with a lot of this transgenderism happening, and a lot of these kids that are so sexualized, that sort of thing, there's a big emphasis on that. Then I actually heard as well, I heard someone being interviewed where they're saying that the Chinese men for the last 20 or so years have been taking steroids, some type of steroids or growth hormone, like by 2 to 3 inches on average in the last 20 or so years. And I mean, if we just look at these parades and things the Chinese do, they are absolutely faultless. You look at the Chinese kids. I mean, there's 2-year-old little kids running around. I watched a TV program once with these little kids going out, doing shopping, doing whatever it is. I mean, they are trained so almost like little robots. Okay. And I'm not sure if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but they really are. So the way they're teaching their kids and their schooling, and it's almost like a militant type of thing, right? Do you think that has a lot to do with that as well, just the way they're training their people?
Well, my experience is pretty limited of teaching at the school for a short period of time. I was deeply impressed by the intelligence of the students and by their inquisitiveness and their openness. And I will say that right now, my book is in the process of being published in China, my most recent book, the 3rd edition, which is quite critical of China. It talks about some of the good things China's done, but it also is very critical. And I was surprised when we wrote the book, my publisher. So they had the other 2 Confessions 1 and Confessions 2 were both published in China, in Chinese, but we were convinced that this one wouldn't be, and it is being. And I have a friend who's read the galley proofs of the translation. He says it's all there. They haven't censored it. So that's I'm impressed, because we do have this idea, at least in the United States, that the Chinese are, they're restricted in what they get to read and so on. But apparently they're going to be able to read my book and including the
Wow.
parts that are quite critical. But I will say, beyond
That's
that,
incredible. That
yeah,
is an absolute feather in your cap as far as that's concerned, because wow, that's a massive market right there. And I
well,
mean that.
yeah, but I would say that's a feather in the cap of China too. It flies in the face of a lot of the propaganda we get in the United States about Chinese people not getting information. And of course, at least prior to the pandemic, there were a lot of Chinese students in the United States and in Europe and all over who were being taught at our schools. So they were getting all that information. There was no attempt to restrict that. Things have changed recently since the pandemic. I think President Xi has made some big blunders since the beginning with the pandemic. And since then, I think this, I'm not sure what's going to happen next. But the fact of the matter is, China has put some very, very bright people out into the world. And they
Right.
really have taken over the investment and trading policies, relationships with many countries that previously had, where the United States was the dominant. Now China is dominating more and more. And one of the things that China has in its favor is that it can show that it had averaged around 10% economic growth for 30 years and brought about 800 million people out of poverty. Nobody
Wow.
else has ever done that. And at the same time, the United States, since the early 70s, we've not had an increase in the real average wage or minimum wage, real when you account for inflation. That has not increased since the early 70s. It's remained
Wow.
same in real terms. Meanwhile, China has had vast improvements. So if you're the
What do you
president,
think? What do you think the secret to that is? Because generally, when one thinks of China, one thinks of a country that is pretty much very restricted in terms of their freedom of speech, their press, etc. That's what I would think anyway. So what do you think is the secret that their economy, and I would imagine it's not just a few rich families then, right? We're talking about the entire Chinese population that is actually benefiting
yeah,
from this. Yeah.
yeah, large parts of it. And well, part of it is that China's been very successful in going out to the world, including Africa, where it dominates today in trade and investments. And
Yes.
so if you're the president of some country that's trying to pull itself out of poverty, and you look at what China's done, you say, I want to emulate what they've done. I want to learn from them because they've done a remarkable job. You may also say, I don't want that kind of government, but I believe I can have our kind. And what kind of government? Maybe we have a democracy, but we could also implement the same sort of economic policies. And incidentally, the other thing, so I've spent the first 7 weeks of this year, 2024, I spent in Latin America, 5 different countries. And I kept hearing, if the United States is a democracy, we don't want it. And these are countries that have turned to China to a large degree. We don't want the United States type of government. You're dysfunctional. You can't even, your Congress can't pass a budget for more than 4 months at a time. You've got a guy like Donald Trump running for president. I hear some, people say, yeah, well, maybe China's got a better system. And so there's this whole thing that's gone on in the world. In many respects, the United States, we've shot ourselves in the foot. We are doing a bad job. And, Muslim countries really resent the fact that we've gone in so strongly to Iraq and Afghanistan and Yemen and so many other places. We hear, oh, the Chinese are really anti-Muslim with the Uyghurs and so on and so forth, which is true. There's no denying that. But other parts of the world also look at what the United States has done in Muslim countries, much, very, very directly and very obviously. And now, of course, in the United States, we're having this huge, these campus demonstrations that pro-Palestine, and it's very complicated. And China, meanwhile, kind of stays out of the fray. They have not gotten directly involved in the Ukraine-Russia war. They are supplying Russia, with technology and advice, but they're not spending a lot of money. They're not sending a lot of weapons and so forth, as far as we know. They've not.
Yeah.
They didn't go into Afghanistan or Iraq. They stayed out of all of that, and they've devoted their resources to going out to the rest of the world and dominating and bringing in, you know, so now they control most of the world's lithium, for example.
Which a lot of it is mined in the Congo.
Yeah.
That's a tragedy. That's a tragedy right there. But I got to tell you, they are very destructive. I mean,
Yes.
they will just they will build roads through. They just destroy anything in their path. When they decide they're building a road or a railway track or anything, I mean, Kenya has huge problems with that.
Yeah.
And you know, I know that there's. I mean, I know I have a lot of Kenyan friends who
they've done some extremely terrible engineering and built power plants and mines. And you know, I'm not defending China at all in this process by any means.
Yeah.
You know, but what I am saying is that they've been very, very effective at playing this game of economic exploitation. They've been extremely effective. They play dirty.
Do you think, I mean, when we talk about the whole COVID jab, what's your point? What's your take on that it came from China? I mean, originally we were told it came from the humble, poor bloody Pangolian, right? That poor Pangolian that is so heavily trafficked, that poor little creature, right? We were told that's where this deadly virus originated from. But what is your take? Because, I mean, I would love to know what you say. I mean, the way I see that, if you're looking at China being the economic hitman, the new economic hitman, boy, what a way to hit back, right?
Well, I have no idea. That's not my
field. Sitting there, are you pleading the fifth?
That's not, well, that's not my field. That's beyond my pay grade, you know, whatever. I can talk about what they've done economically in countries and how they've made those hits, but I have no idea about biology or
and that sort of stuff. Okay, well, I'll let you off the hook for that one.
I'm not on the hook.
Well, I know you've effectively slid off that hook. You weren't even taking the bait there.
The fact of the matter is, Chantelle, I think what we need to understand is that the United States and China and many other countries, we're all participating in what I call this death economy. And it has to end, you know, and that's what I devote myself to now. That's why I wrote the 3rd edition about China and so on. And that we need to come together and recognize that the real enemy is our belief system in the maximizing short-term profits for corporations and materialistic consumption for everyone else. That is a belief system. It's a perception that's driving us toward self-destruction. There's no question about it, a death economy. We must turn that around. The Chinese must turn it around. The Russians, the South Africans, you know, and South Africa is part of the China thing. You have BRICS. BRICS is...
First it was Russia, now we're part of China. Yeah. I have no idea, because in the 70s, Russia was so in here. Russia and Cuba were training everyone, and I don't know what happened to poor Russia. Now China's in here, so yeah, it's quite
But to recognize that all of us, you know, the common enemy is this belief system. You know, we've alienated ourselves from our planet. We've said we're apart from nature, we're part of nature. And that, to me, that's the most important point. And we're living in times right now when we all need to come together, not fight each other over ideology or anything. Yeah, we can compete on an economic basis, but let's come together and address the real problem that's facing us. And let's turn this death economy into a regenerative life economy that pays people to clean up the plastic that's floating around in the oceans and recycle it. You know, replant forests that have been destroyed, and pay people to come up with new technologies to replace old forms of energy and transportation. There's so much. It's such an exciting time to really move forward and do the right thing.
I fully agree with you. And that was actually kind of bringing me to my last question, because I know we're just hitting an hour now. And I know you've done some amazing stuff. I've been following you and seeing what you're doing. You've actually been doing some amazing stuff. You've had a major, wonderful, beautiful turnaround in your life. Obviously, I think that happened many years ago already. But I'd love to hear, maybe just if you can end off with that. What are you doing nowadays? What are you involved in? I know you're involved in the Amazon and just doing some really cool stuff and bringing, as you say, we got to come together, because at the end of the day, we are all human beings. We all want the same thing. This whole divide and conquer strategy has been, and as you say, that has created this death economy, right? And that has created, like, this kill, kill, kill. If you don't understand something, just kill it. If you don't like it, just kill it, and this is where it's gotten us, right? So I'd love to know, what are you up to now, and what are you doing?
Yeah, well, I love to write, and I'm still writing and speaking and being on shows like this. I think I'd like to leave you with 5 questions that I think every one of your listeners can ask themselves. It'll take us to the right place. Okay? Yeah. So the first question is, what do I most want to do for the rest of my life? What will bring me the greatest satisfaction? And incidentally, these are in my most recent book. And I would answer that by saying, I want to write. I love to write. I really enjoy writing. But I have a friend at the opposite end of the spectrum. He's a carpenter. He doesn't like to write. He likes to work with his hands and wood. Second question is, how do I do this in a way that helps transform the death economy to a life economy? And I'd say, I'm going to write about it. I'm going to try to inspire people in my writing and my speaking to do that. And my carpenter friend would say, I'm only going to use sustainable materials in my carpentry work. And I know how many trees are cut to create the wood that I use in building this cabinet here behind me. I'm going to replant all those trees. I'm going to replant 2 trees for every one that I destroy, that I use. And the third question is, all right, so what is it that's keeping me from doing this? And I might say, well, I know that to be a successful writer, I've got to write for at least 2 hours every day. I just don't have time. And my carpenter friend might say, well, my clients aren't willing to pay the extra money to replant those trees or to produce sustainable products. And the fourth question is, when I really touch that blockage that's holding me back, that's keeping me back, what message do I get? And as a writer, I'd say, well, I get the message that I could turn off the television for an hour or 2 every night and write, or I could get up a little earlier and write. And my carpenter friend would say, well, I'm going to tell my clients that if they pay a little extra for the sustainable materials, it's not a cost. It's an investment in the future. It's an investment for themselves and their children.
Absolutely.
And the fifth question is, well, what actions do I take immediately? So I got to write. And my carpenter friend has to build with sustainable materials and tell his clients, look, I'm taking care of the future, and tell the kids, the children of his clients, look what your parents are doing for your future. And I think if every one of us, it only takes a few minutes, we can do this a couple of times a week, ask ourselves these 5 questions. The first 2 may not change frequently or may not at all, but the last 3 probably will, because once I've decided I'm going to take some time to write, the next question is, what am I going to write? And then what's the first sentence? What's the second sentence? Right. And so on. So I'm deeply committed to, I work with corporations a lot, but I also want everybody to understand that we all are consumers. A lot of us are investors, or we're employees of companies, or we're management. Every one of us has a role to play in this process. It's exciting to be part of it.
I can't imagine living at a more exciting time on this planet than now. Right. We, as you say, we really are at the precipice of turning things around, turning that death economy into this amazing new, not the new world order, but this new
life economy. Life economy.
Yeah, I love it. Life economy, exactly that. So we have this, and we're alive. We are able to express ourselves in ways that we've never been able to express ourselves before. Right. There's the majority of the planet doesn't have this hierarchy of one dominating the other. Women are equals, you know, there's no such thing anymore. You know, we're able to express ourselves in ways that we haven't been able to express ourselves before. And it's amazing, you know, and yes, you know, sometimes the scale does this because until such time that we find our equilibrium, but that's possible for all of us. And I love these questions. I've written them down and I'm going to listen to this again so that, you know, I'm going to put it out there.
Well, and they are in the last book, the third edition of Confessions, right. And you know, people can also go to my website, johnperkins.org, to get that information.
Yeah, I want to just and your books are available on Amazon, right?
Everywhere.
And your website is johnperkins.org.
Right. Books are available wherever you buy books, basically. I mean, they should be.
Right.
If they're not in your local bookstore, complain. But yeah, also on all the different internet marketing tools.
Yeah,
but you can just go to
amazing. It's been such a pleasure talking to you again. It really, 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 really has been. And thank you so much for being my guest. It's been an absolute pleasure. And if ever you come to South Africa, find me.
Okay, I'll do that. Thank you.
You haven't been here, have you? You haven't been here.
No, arrange.
Oh no, you are missing out on so much. But I warn you, and I say this to everyone: once you come to Africa, you don't want to leave. There's something about Africa.
I want to go so badly, and my partner, she's never been to sub-Saharan Africa and wants to go. So arrange. I'd love to go and speak at a university or something. I don't require.
Well, let's do it.
I don't require any payment. I just want to get the word out. Just pay my airfare, and I'll be there. Get somebody. Get it. So
I'm gonna make some phone calls. I'm gonna make some phone calls, and I got to tell you, a place that you absolutely have to go, which is my favorite place, is Namibia, which is ex-Southwest Africa. It used to be Southwest. You know, it's incredible when you take a trip. I mean, I've been working there for many years, so I would literally, but usually I would fly. But every now and again, I would take a road trip. And once you cross the border, within 5 kilometers, the whole vegetation has changed completely. The energy has changed completely. The Namib Desert forms part of Earth's original crust. So it's like more than 300 million odd years, whatever, you know, arguably. Oh. But you go to this place called the Moon Valley. It looks like the moon. But you like this big, and there are these rocks, these massive rocks and of course the wildlife. You lie and you sleep under the stars at night, you hear a lion roaring and the whole earth vibrates. I mean, you have no idea. Meanwhile, it sounds like it's right next to you. You won't want to go home again, I'll tell you that much. But
my bag is packed. Always.
We'll arrange that. No, let me make some phone calls. I think it'll be fantastic. So yeah.
Great.
John, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. And
my pleasure.
And I want to just say thank you so much to all our viewers for watching, for joining us this evening. It's really been amazing to have you guys here as well. So, okay, everybody, God bless you all. And I'll see you very soon. Thank you, John. Cheers.